Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe button. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Chapter 8. The Forced Migration. A process of capture and transport was set in motion by the slave trade that changed maritime history, economic history, and created an immigrant population in the Caribbean islands and in the Americas, who were forced out of their homes against their will. The basis of this force was the need and greed of Europe. Their forced migration was a process that ignored the humanity of a large portion of humankind. This process, set in motion during the latter part of the 15th century, would last over 300 years until slavery was turned into colonization, a more sophisticated form of slavery. There is a need now to look at this process and how it was set in motion. Most of the information used for this examination is taken from the article, African Slave Trade, the Cruelest Commerce, September 1992, National Geographic, by Colin Palmer, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. From Basil Davidson's Black Mothers, The Years of the African Slave Trade, and A. Adu Bohen's The Coming of the Europeans, Horizon History of Africa. To set the process in motion, the African was totally dehumanized in the minds of the Europeans. So far as most of them were concerned, the Africans were outside of the grace of God. Africans became living commodities in a world trade system that laid the basis for modern capitalism. The Middle Passage, the condition of the transfer of the Africans across the Atlantic to the various ports of embarkation where they were to be sold as slaves, is the most tragic story of forced migration in human history. Europe took full advantage of wars and conflicts between West African tribes and nations and began to purchase some of the captives and prisoners of war as slaves. The kind of slavery that the European was about to introduce into West Africa had no relationship to the African system of indentured servitude. In the African system, the slave was usually a loser in a local war. He was not enslaved separate from his family, and no slave was sent outside of Africa. Some slaves with talent rose to be kings in the very house in which they had been slaves. The word slave in West Africa had an entirely different meaning than it had when used by the Europeans. The slave in Africa did not lose his humanity. Some African chiefs or kings became corrupt and went into the slave trade because they wanted to. The Europeans sold firearms to one African group to either protect themselves or capture another group. The European gunpowder, rum, and cheap bric-a-brac coming from the embryo of what will eventually become the European Industrial Revolution was traded for slaves. In every slave fort in West Africa, there is a door of no return. The captured slaves went out of this door to the beach and subsequently to the boats that would take them away from their home forever. The condition on these boats was beyond anything described in a concentration camp or in a chain gang in the South of the 1920s and 1930s. Professor Colin Palmer described the condition and the establishment of these slave-holding forts in the following manner. To facilitate trade, forts were established along the West African coast. The Gold Coast, contemporary Ghana, saw construction of more than 50 such posts along 300 miles of coastline. The larger forts were called castles. Among the best known, Elmina Castle in Ghana was built by the Portuguese in 1482, but fell to the Dutch in 1637. Cape Coast Castle, begun by the Swedes in 1653, was later held by the Dey, or ruler, of the Fitu people. It was acquired by the Dutch in 1664 and by the English in 1665. This castle could accommodate more than 1,000 slaves. Professor Palmer further informs us that the Atlantic Passage tested bodies and souls to their limits. The human cargoes were arranged on wooden platforms like books on a shelf on various levels in the cramped hold. Rarely was there space for an adult to stand erect. Some had barely enough room to lie down. One ship's surgeon observed that the traders wedged them in so that they had not so much room as a man in his coffin, either in length or breadth. It was impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. Some traders, of course, realized that such crowding increased the incidence of disease and death. One agent of the Royal African Company complained in 1704 of inadequate space on the ship Postilion. The slaves are so large, and it being the general opinion that the slaves could not be healthy in the space of 3 foot, they broke up one of the platforms, which was the person she couldn't carry more than 100 slaves. 8 years later, the company advised its agents at Cape Coast Castle, "Pray lade no more than are necessary to prevent mortality, which has often happened by crowding the ship with too many Negroes." Not until the 18th century did European countries engaged in the trade set standards for the allocation of space to the slaves. It may be doubted whether the rules were obeyed. Fearing rebellion, ships' crews generally chained the slaves securely in the hold, usually in pairs, the right ankle of one connected to the left ankle of the other. James Penny, who commanded trading vessels for more than 20 years, recounted that when no danger is apprehended, their fetters are by degrees taken off. With so many bodies closely packed together, the heat below decks became unbearable. The air reeked of excrement and infected sores. By the 18th century, ships customarily had portholes to aid ventilation, wind sails to throw down a current of air, and grantings on the decks. But to the human cargo, the hold remained a fetid hell. A cruel, philosophical argument developed among the slave traders between the concept of tight pack and loose pack. When the slaves were tightly packed on the ship, more could be loaded on, but more died. In loose pack, more survived the journey because they had breathing space because fewer slaves were packed on the ship. Therefore, when slaves arrived at the port of debarkation, they were in a healthier condition. The argument would go on for another 100 years. There is a small library of literature on the Middle Passage, some written by captains of slave ships. The rationale and the pretense in England was that the slave was primitive, unchristian, and that slavery brought them under the tutelage of Christianity. Other slave-trading nations took the same attitude. The best literature illustrating this rationale came from the Catholic and the Protestant Church. It is time that we look, at least briefly, at slavery in what is referred to as the New World and how it developed. Chapter 9. The Slave Trade in the New World. The Africans were no strangers to the New World. They seem to have been in North America and South America long before Columbus. This is more than an assumption. Thanks to the research of Professor Leo Weiner, reported in his Africa and the Discovery of America, and the work of Harold G. Lawrence in another book called African Explorers to the New World. The first Africans who came to the New World were not in bondage, contrary to popular belief. Africans participated in some of the early expeditions, mainly with Spanish explorers. The best known of these African explorers was Estevanico, sometimes known as Little Stephen, who accompanied the de Vaca expedition during 6 years of wandering from Florida to Mexico. The remarkable thing about Estevanico, who came to America in 1527, is that he was a remarkable linguist. He learned the language of the Indians in a matter of weeks. Because of his knowledge of herbs and medicines, he was accepted as a deity by some Indian tribes. In 1539, Estevanico set out from Mexico in a party with Fray Marco de Niza in search of the fabulous 7 cities of Cibola. When most of the expedition, including Fray Marcos, became ill, Estevanico went on alone and opened up what is now known as New Mexico and Arizona. A number of historians have stated that Pedro Nino, one of the pilots of the command ship of Christopher Columbus, was an African. In the discovery of the Pacific in 1513, Balboa carried 30 Africans, who helped to clear the road across the isthmus between the two oceans. In the conquest of Mexico, Cortez was accompanied by a number of Africans. Incidentally, one was a pioneer of wheat farming in the New World. In the exploration of Guatemala, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela, Africans arrived nearly 100 years before they reappeared as slaves in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619. Thus, Africans were major contributors to the making of the New World, and they did not come culturally empty-handed. Many of the Africans brought to the New World such skills as ironworking, leatherworking, and carpentry. Before the breaking up of the social structure of the West, African states such as Ghana and Songhai and the internal strife that made the slave trade possible, many Africans, especially West Africans, lived in a society in which university life was fairly common and scholars were held in reverence. In that period in Western African history, the University of Sankore at Timbuktu was flourishing, and its great chancellor, the last of the monumental scholars of West Africa, Ahmed Baba, reigned over that university. A great African scholar, he wrote 47 books, each on a separate subject. He received all of his education within Africa. In fact, he did not leave the Western Sudan until he was exiled to Morocco during the invasion in 1594. My point is this. There existed in Africa, prior to the beginning of the slave trade, a cultural way of life that in many ways was equal, if not superior, to many of the cultures then existing in Europe. And the slave trade destroyed these cultures and created a dilemma that the African has not been able to extract himself from to this day. There were, in the Africans' past, rulers who extended kingdoms into empires, great armies that subdued entire nations, generals who advanced the technique of military science, scholars with wisdom and foresight, and priests who told of gods that were kind and strong. But with the bringing of the African to the New World, every effort was made to destroy his memory of having ever been part of a free and intellectual people. The greater destroyer of African culture, the greatest exploiter of the African, was the plantation system of the New World. The African was transformed into something called a Negro. He was demeaned. This is the thing that is uniquely tragic about the African slave system. Of all the slave systems in the world, no other dehumanized the slave more than that started by the Europeans in the 15th century. Using the church as a rationale, they began to set up myths that nearly always read the African out of human history, beginning with the classification of the African as a lesser being. The Catholic Church's justification for slavery was that the African was being brought under the guidance of Christendom and that he would eventually receive its blessings. The rationale was that slavery was a blessing to the African. It was not. There were several competing slave systems in the New World. In order to understand the effects of these various systems on the personality of the Africans, we have to look at each one individually. In Cuba and Haiti, often the Africans were a majority in the population. This is also true of certain portions of Brazil. Therefore, the system operated differently in these areas, and although it was still slavery, the African had some cultural mobility. In South America and in the West Indies, the slave master did not outlaw the African drum, African ornamentations, African religion, or other things dear to the African, remembered from this former way of life. This permitted a form of cultural continuity among the slaves in the West Indies, Cuba, and South America that did not exist in the United States. In the Portuguese area, in the West Indies, and often in South America, the plantation owner would buy a shipload or half a shipload of slaves. These slaves usually came from the same areas in Africa, and they naturally spoke the same language and had the same basic culture. Families, in the main, were kept together. If a slave on an island was sold to a plantation owner at the other end of the island, he could still walk to see his relatives. This made for a form of cultural continuity among the slaves in South America, Cuba, and Haiti that later made their revolts more successful than revolts in the United States. In the United States, in the fight to destroy every element of culture of the slaves, the system was cruel. No other system did so much to demean the personality of the slave, to deny his personality, or to ruthlessly sell family members away from each other. The American slave system operated almost like the American brokerage system. If a person bought 20 slaves at the beginning of the week and found himself short of cash at the end of the week, he might, if the price was right, sell 10. Then these men might be resold within a few days. The family, the most meaningful entity in African life, was systematically and deliberately destroyed. But in South America, the slave managed to stay in his group and therefore preserve some of his cultural continuity. In spite of these drastic drawbacks, the Africans in the Americas, including the United States, made a meaningful contribution to the preservation of the countries in which he was a slave. Another neglected aspect of the African in the New World is the role of the African women. Comparatively, few white women were brought to the New World during the first 100 years. Many families of the New World originated from cohabitation between the white slave master and the African woman. Later, this same slave master, especially in the United States, made and supported laws forbidding his own child to have an education or sit beside him on public transportation. In Haiti, the African woman sometimes had a kind of semi-legal status. In South America, especially in Brazil, sometimes the white slave master married the African woman and she became a free person. These free African women in South America began to maneuver their husbands in an attempt to lessen the harness of the slave system. In the United States, however, there could be no such maneuver. Haiti and Cuba, during this early period, were dominated by their mother countries. Wars were started within these countries to liberate them from their European masters. Africans made a meaningful contribution toward the early liberation of Cuba, Haiti, and other areas of South America. They fought with Simon Bolivar for the freedom of South America and fought valiantly to free Haiti from the domination of the French. In the United States, especially in the American Revolution, the African slave often took the place of a white person who decided that he did not want to fight and fought with the promise that he would get his freedom afterward. Thousands of Africans fought in the American Revolution with this promise. And a little-known incident in our history is that thousands of Africans fought with the British when the British made the same promise and the African believed them. Apparently, it depended on who got to him first. The African was a major contributor in the making of the New World. The economy of the New World rested largely on slave labor. For many years, 1/3 of the trade of the New World was with the small island of Santo Domingo, which later became Haiti. Haiti and the other Caribbean islands also influenced the economic system of Europe. Slavery and the slave trade was the first international investment in capital. It was the first large-scale investment that was intercontinental. Many Europeans invested in ships and in the goods and services taken from these African countries and became independently wealthy. But the slave revolts continued. By the end of the 17th century, the picture of slavery began to change drastically. Economic necessity, not racial prejudice, originally directed the African slave trade to the New World. As early as 1663, a group of slaves joined a group of white indentured servants in a revolt. Some slaves took the Christian version of the Bible literally and believed that God meant for them to be free men. Slaves such as Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, who led a revolt of 40,000 slaves in 1800. In 1822, in Charleston, South Carolina, a carpenter, Denmark Vesey, planned one of the many extensive slave revolts on record, but he was betrayed and put to death with many of his followers. And in 1831, Nat Turner led the greatest slave revolt ever to occur in Virginia. The slaves never accepted their condition passively. In his book, American Negro Slave Revolts, Dr. Herbert Aptheker records 250 slave revolts. The African slave in the Americas, in addition to assisting in the freedom and the economy of these countries, made a major contribution to his freedom. In the story of the rise and fall of great African states, and subsequently the slave trade, we are trying to deal with something much bigger than history itself. We are trying to deal with an old situation and a new situation, and trying to address ourselves to the current cry for black history and black power. Our major point is this. The African people who became slaves in the United States have been many things in history, good and bad. They have ruled great nations, and they have destroyed great nations. They are profoundly human, and they have played every role in the human drama, from saint to buffoon. Slavery does not represent the sum total of our history. We are searching for a definition of our African heritage and to determine what it means to a people emerging from bondage into the light of freedom, re-entering the mainstream of world history as participants. A good definition of heritage or history is heritage is something acquired or transmitted by a predecessor. It is also called the legacy, tradition, and birthright. But when we speak of our people, perhaps a new and better definition is in order. In his book, Tom Tom, John Vandercook said, "A race is like a man. Until it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, and loves its own memories, it can never fulfill itself completely." Heritage, in essence, is how a people have used their talents to command the respect of other people. The ultimate purpose of our heritage and heritage teaching is to show our people how, through identity and through respect for themselves, they can work to liberate themselves from the old ties of bondage. A person's relationship to his heritage, after all, is the same as the relationship of a child to its mother.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.